This episode of ALN Thursday at 4 features ALN board member and ALN senior fellow Jack Kelly. Mike Bornaro interviews Jack about his time at the OMB when he worked on the Recovery Act implementation, directed by then Vice President Joseph Biden.
I'm very happy today to be talking with Jack Kelly, specifically about Mr. Kelly's involvement in the Recovery Act. He had a role in that. He was addressing risk management, but I will let him talk about this picture. And usually we kind of build up to things. So Jack, why don't you explain what this picture is?
First thing I want to say is when Mike first approached me about this, I thought, we need to open this whole presentation with the Star Wars crawl. It needs to come up on the screen, say, many years ago in a galaxy far, far away, something happened. Well, for me, this was 11 years ago. And my time at OMB seems like a galaxy far, far away. But what happened was in 2008, I moved from the budget side of OMB over to the management side in the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And I was responsible initially for cleaning up procurement data and the government's big procurement database. And then I was assigned the lead responsibility for strategic sourcing, the government-wide strategic sourcing program. So I was pretty busy by the time 2009 rolled around. And 2009 in February was when the Recovery Act was signed. A lot of things were happening. I wasn't involved in the early setup of the Recovery Act stuff. And in about April or May, I get a call from basically from Ed DeSev's office, who was then working for the vice president as the head of the Recovery Implementation Office, to come over and talk to him about possibly working for him on the Recovery Act implementation team. I went over and I talked to Ed, and how this picture got taken was at one of the Recovery Act cabinet meetings afterwards. Ed, whose arm you can see in the back of that picture, brought me over to introduce me to the vice president. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that, how I got to that point. But so when I sat down and talked to Ed DeSev, I need to tell you a little bit about Ed. Ed was under the Clinton administration, he ended up being the deputy director for management at OMB. That is the most senior management position in OMB. Before that, he had been the head of the Office of Federal Financial Management, which basically made him the government's chief financial officer. So he had a depth of experience in OMB management policy issues, particularly in the financial management area. So he was a big deal in OMB's history. So when he invited me to come over, I was pleased, but really kind of stunned. And he sat me down and he said what he wanted me to do was to lead an effort to assess agency risk management practices with regard to their spending of implementation of Recovery Act funds. And so, I didn't know a whole lot about risk management at that point. But I said, sure. And I asked him, what he had in mind. And what he said first was, well, risk management is one of the several areas in the OMB guidance that went out shortly after the act was passed that no one's been paying attention to. And so I need somebody to pay attention to that and find out what agencies are really doing to implement that guidance. He said, but you don't have to do a really deep dive. I just need to basically, show that we've paid attention to it, so we can't be criticized for that. And my response was, I'm not going to do work that's not going to be actually meaningful. So, if you are looking for somebody to kind of, wave a flag and say risk management's over here, and that's it. I'm not that person. So he said, well, you can do with it whatever you want. You can take it as far as you think you can take it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. I also asked him, I don't know how much of y'all remember the Recovery Act. The number $800 billion was I think the total amount associated with it. And what a lot of people didn't realize was that $800 billion wasn't all one big appropriations bill. It was a combination of about $500 billion in appropriations, a couple $100 billion in grants and maybe loans and loan guarantees, and maybe another 100 billion or so in tax relief, which was to encourage different kinds of investments. One of the big goals was to increase jobs and reduce unemployment, which was a huge problem at that point in time. I mean, the Recovery Act was that day's pandemic. It was like the biggest crisis facing the country that the Recovery Act was responding to. So I asked Ed where that $800 billion number had come from. And he kind of danced around it for a while. In fact, he didn't answer it for several weeks. I finally learned that number came from the National Economic Council, which are basically a bunch of economists that are in this office in the White House. And they had based that number on some old economic models, macroeconomic models that said, for every $100 billion you put into the economy, X 100,000 or million jobs are created. So it was that kind of relationship, and they figured out this is the job goal that we have, although they never articulated a job goal. They just said, here's how much money should generate. If history tells us anything, it should generate X 100,000 jobs or million jobs, whatever it was. So I thought that was kind of ridiculous because when I'm an engineer by training, and so if I were trying to craft a program to address jobs, I would look around the country for where jobs are, where jobs are non-existent, where there's high unemployment. I'd look at what businesses they're in, what industries, and then I would craft a program that was focused on dealing with solving specific job-related problems. But that's not what happened with the Recovery Act. The big initial push for the Recovery Act folks was getting the money out the door, getting contracts awarded, getting performance on contracts started. It was a massive data gathering effort. And Office of Federal Procurement Policy, where I worked, had a big role in gathering the data that was related to contracts. But then you had to work with Treasury to assign those contracts to different appropriations. So anyway, it was enormous data thing. The other thing that people didn't realize was that $800 billion basically was given to Congress just like a normal budget request, and Congress then used its normal ways of doing business to distribute the money down to different committees and subcommittees. Again, there was no analysis that said these are the likely job consequences of the way this money is being spent. It was just run through the normal pipes and went to the normal places based on the politics of that day. So when I first started out in trying to do something about risk management, the first thing I thought I would do is let me reach out to my colleagues in OMB. Risk management at that time, the only OMB guidance on risk management was contained in the version of OMB Circular A123, which existed at that time. And that circular was basically focused on internal controls. And so when that circular talked about risk management, it was about the risk of financial fraud, basically, of not having accurate financial statements. It wasn't broad risk management as we now think about it, and as enlightened people thought about it then. So I went to the branch chief in charge of the OFFM branch that actually issued that guidance, that circular. And the other thing I failed to mention is that the initial OMB guidance that went out, the one that had a big section on risk management, as well as other, contracting and other subjects, also had a requirement that agencies report back on what they had done by the 1st of May. And so I went and asked this guy, I said, so who in your office is going to be reviewing these agency reports for risk management? He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He said, we don't have the bandwidth to do that. And so here they are, they created this guidance, they sent it out, and then they had no interest or inclination or intention to review the reports required by that guidance. And I thought, well, these guys are kind of worthless. I'll have to, let me reach out somewhere else. So I went to the various, what they call resource management offices. Those are basically the budget branches, or we call them RMOs. And they are, the idea behind an RMO was that all of the OMB guidance, budget guidance and management guidance, would be funneled to agencies through these resource management offices. That concept never worked because resource management offices remain focused on budgets. And occasionally management offices would try to coordinate their management policies with the budget branches, but that was kind of an exception, not the norm. But anyway, I went to the budget branches and I said, hey, we're trying to determine how well your programs are handling Recovery Act money. Can you provide some insights into that? And again, they said, no, we got a budget to worry about. We don't have time for this extra stuff, even though it was like the most important thing the country was doing at that time. The other people I went to were the people that managed the performance reporting thing. There was a performance.gov website, which I think still exists. And there was a law called the Government Results and Performance Act, which required agencies to have strategic plans, and those strategic plans contained performance goals, which were supposed to be reported on. I mean, the achievement of those goals. Well, I went to that person and I said, hey, one of the things when you talk about risk management is got to be programmatic risk. In fact, in my mind, that was the biggest thing. Is this program going to accomplish what it's intended to do with this money? And they looked at me again like I had lost my mind and said, well, frankly, the kind of performance data we are now focusing on are performance against high priority presidential goals. So we may not even be looking at the programs that are going to be funded, or not all the programs that are going to be funded by the Recovery Act. We're just going to be looking at some of them. So, they offered no assistance whatsoever. So I went back and I started basically putting together my own approach, which was run out of the Recovery Act office. During that time, I would sit in on a number of these Recovery Act meetings, and there were like weekly reports. Let me set the stage. There was a high sense of urgency about getting this money out and about being able to tell the public how the administration was doing in this extremely important program. So there were weekly meetings with high-level, agency officials. Those meetings were often chaired by the vice president or by Ed or other senior people in the Recovery Act office. There was a high degree of agency interaction. And so that picture that you saw earlier was from one of those meetings. And the meetings were interesting, and you might be interested I'll share something you might find interesting. In the meetings that I was in with the vice president, senior agency people, sometimes cabinet secretaries or deputy secretaries, would be presenting on the Recovery Act programs that they were responsible for. And in many cases, they would get into a lot of detail about how the program worked at a local level. And on at least two of these meetings, the vice president jumped right in and said, wait a minute, that's not the way this program works. And what I realized is that he had been in government from all levels, starting with local government all the way up to the Senate and now the vice presidency. And he had deep experience in a lot of government programs, probably deeper experience than a lot of those agency people had. So he was able to actually challenge them on things that they were saying that he knew simply weren't true. And it was sometimes it could be kind of contentious. In fact, the nickname for the vice president among the staff was Sheriff Joe when he behaved in ways like that, when he was really kind of contentious. So my attention at that time turned to how can I gather information from each of these agencies on what they're doing with regard to risk management, and how can I raise this to a significantly high enough level that they will take it seriously and they will actually produce some good work. So we came up with this. I can't remember the acronym now. Unfortunately, I didn't take a lot of the data away with me when I retired. I archived it before I left. But what I do remember was it was a very structured set of data, set of tables, and set of questions. And I would assemble their responses into a notebook, and then I would, that notebook would be used by Ed DeSev basically by Ed DeSev, to host meetings with the senior agency people to go over their risk management plans. So it ended up being kind of a nicely structured way that agencies could bring to the table how they were approaching risk management. And it was some great conversations. I'm really sorry that I don't have some of the documentation that I could share with you. I will say that the agencies that had the strongest risk management plans that I remember, probably the one that stands out the most was the Department of Energy. and probably number two was NASA. And I think the reason for that is both of those agencies are staffed with a lot of scientists and a lot of engineers, and they understand risk management in a way that a lot of the agencies like HUD or education that basically just move money that don't understand it. And so, I mean, when you look at energy, for example, they had set up an internal website that all of their components could report in not just the financial information, but also the risk, how their risk management programs were working. And one of the things that people who spend time on risk management know is that the two big things about risk management, when you identify a risk, you want to know what its likelihood is and what its severity is. And you create one of these Gardner quadrants, and you look for anything that is a high likelihood and high severity. That's the stuff you focus on first. And then the other stuff, when you get to it. But if it's going to happen, it's likely to happen, and when it happens, it's going to be catastrophic, that's what you want to jump on right away. So we had these meetings. I think they went really pretty well. We certainly got attention. I would go over and meet with the agency people at their headquarters and have them walk me through the program, show me whatever, if they claimed something, I'd want to see evidence of what they claimed. So it was a fun time, and really kept me pretty busy for a number of months.
Jack, can you explain also what you thought was good about the NASA risk management? Because what I think is useful of this conversation is you compared what you went through then, what the country went through then, to what we're going through now. And so anything that we can learn from past experience and bring forward would be great.
Well, so unfortunately, Mike, I actually have some of the documents from DOE, but I don't have any of the documents from NASA. But what I remember, what I remember about NASA and DOE is that they looked at their programs in a very in-depth way. And so when you talk about, and I don't know where, again, this is all about how Recovery Act money was spent. And I just don't remember how the Recovery Act money was spent for NASA. But for the, in fact, let me look to see how much they got. They didn't, they hardly got any. So, and energy got a bunch. And some of the energy money was devoted to things like environmental cleanup out in Washington State. And when you talk about that as a project, there are huge risks associated with environmental cleanup activities. And they're quantifiable, they're credible. I mean, you have something really meaty to talk about. And they had a lot of money. So anyway, when all of this came to an end, one of the things that I had realized was that a problem that needed fixing was the guidance that set out the risk management program, which was A123. And so I asked Ed DeSev to, remember, he was a senior person in the vice president's office, to reach out to Jeff Zients, who is one of these, I think he's currently a co-chair on the Biden transition effort. And he reached out to Jeff, who was then the deputy for management at OMB. And I asked him to ask Jeff to set up a meeting that he would chair, and it would be the career deputy for the Office of Federal Financial Management and the career deputy for the Office of Performance Management, I'll call it, and me, because I wanted those two guys in the meeting to make a pitch for revising A123 and turning it into a true enterprise risk management circular. Now this would have been in 2009 or 2010 probably. So the guy from the performance side looked at me like he didn't have any clue what I was talking about. He just didn't understand how program performance had anything to do with risk. I mean, he's not the brightest bulb in the tree. The guy who was the deputy from the Federal Financial Management, he absolutely got it. But his comment back was, I think that you make a great point, but we just don't have the bandwidth to do that. They seem to be bandwidth challenged in that office. So I felt really depressed because I thought, I thought I'd made a compelling case and nothing. Well, in 2016, OMB reissued OMB Circular A123, and now it's all about enterprise risk management. Before I retired, I tried to find out, well, actually, no, after I retired, because I retired in 2013. But once I learned about this, I reached back out to some of my former OMB colleagues and tried to find out who had actually written this, because it was amazingly good. And I'll share a few aspects of it with you. It's some of the aspects of that circular are similar to subjects that are incorporated in the ISO management system standards. For example, requiring agencies to coordinate their enterprise risk management activities with strategic planning and strategic review processes established by the Performance Act. Requiring agencies to establish the context of their organizations. Requiring leadership from agency C-suites and close collaboration across all agency mission and mission support functions. Requiring agencies' approach to develop risk profiles and implementing the enterprise risk management to be refined and improved each year. Continuous improvement, as we talk about in ISO 55000. Recognizing that agencies are at different maturity levels in terms of their capacities to fully implement enterprise risk management. And there were a bunch of others. Whoever wrote this clearly was familiar with some of the management system standards requirements, because these mirror the management system standards requirements. What the circular didn't do, however, was something that from an ISO 55001 perspective, you realize has to be done. It created a very collaborative framework for creating agency-specific guidance, but it didn't require that guidance to be taken down deep within the organizations. As we know from ISO 55001, what you need is a cascading series of asset management plans that start with a strategic asset management plan to look at the big stuff, and then cascading down in some cases to individual asset management plans, asset management plans for specific assets. And if you are, for example, the Corps of Engineers or other federal agencies that have a high degree of, your missions depend on assets, then if you're trying to look at the risk management program for your agency, you've got to take risk down to the asset level, because that's program failure in many cases is going to result from asset failure. And so you need to be able to connect asset performance and risk. And that's what ISO 55001 requires you to do. So it's really too bad that OMB didn't understand that. OMB is used to sending out guidance to like agency heads or chief information officers, people at the very high levels of the organizations. And then they think they're done. They've sent the guidance out, and now it's up to those agencies to figure out what to do with it. Well, that's just not a really smart way to proceed. And as a consequence of that, OMB management guidance is not known for being all that effective. In fact, the Partnership for Public Service did a whole report on this several years ago, which I thought was pretty interesting. Anyhow.
So Jack, that's a very good deep dive into some behind the scenes activities in our federal executive management of legislative acts. And this is a unique situation in that we had a question ahead of time when it was seen that you were going to be talking about risk management. There was a question about how do you bring that through the culture? And I think some of the things that you were just talking about addresses that, but can you let us know what you think about bringing that through the culture?
I've done a lot of government-wide management reform efforts, mostly focused on specific kinds of programs, travel, for example, motor vehicle management, aircraft management. And so they're kind of narrowly focused, but I take a common approach to all of them. I first create an executive committee that gets the assistant secretary level people involved in the overall policy decisions for that reform effort. These are the senior people in their agencies responsible for whatever the activity was that I was trying to improve. And then I require the agencies to provide, working level experts, the people that actually know something about the subject area. And then together we figure out what makes the most sense. And then the other thing I would do is I would, all the stuff that I worked on had to do with one administrative services of one kind or another. So I always worked with GSA to create a little office, a little staff office that could staff that interagency committee of the work of the agency level experts. And then they would come up with ideas that they thought could make things better. Sometimes there would be, OMB might have a priority that I would put in the mix so that it would, we could solve a problem that OMB cared about. But mainly I was interested in having them solve problems that they cared about. And then we would have GSA issue a federal management regulation that would actually implement whatever the policies that the interagency group wanted. So the way that I think you approach change management is you have to involve the people whose behavior you want to change. And you have to communicate with those people.
That's ISO 55001 4.2, involving all relevant stakeholders.
Yep. And I had learned that painfully over many years before ISO 55000 was ever written.
Which is why you knew to establish the offices with enough people in there to be able to start developing the culture that you wanted.
Yep. And by the way, the other thing is communication is critical, and not just communication out, but communication back from the field to find out, what's working, what's not working, and to give the people whose behavior you're trying to change, a real stake in what happens and a real, sense of participation in what happens. You have to, in other words, short answer is you have to engage the culture you're trying to change.
Okay. So when we were doing our roundtables with Booz Allen Hamilton, and they would get their federal clients together, and each would present to each other, and the Asset Leadership Network would present to all of them, there was great interest in risk management. When we went through the 6 different elements of ISO 55000, the continuous improvement wasn't, anything, but when we said risk management, head snapped up.
Absolutely.
Would you be willing to help us develop a program on addressing risk management in federal agencies or organizational risk management?
Absolutely. But what I would suggest is, and this was my experience during the Recovery Act implementation, is you've got a number of agencies out there that understand the importance of it and understand it at an absolutely practical level. In other words, they live with these risks every day, and the risks in the case of DoD, for example, can kill people. So I suspect that there are a lot of agency risk management experts out there, and it would be really fun to kind of create an event where we could bring a bunch of them together and have them share things that they've learned.
That's what a network does. So what we can do is reach out to our active participants and find out what is of interest to them, and then reach out through our network to find some of these experts, bring together people, and have a web program addressing risk management.
I think that would be great.
Since you've had experience in this, we look forward to your participation. And thank you in general, Jack, for all of the energy and expertise you bring to the Asset Leadership Network. There was a question about the actual name of the A123 circular.
It's called Management's Responsibility for Enterprise Risk Management and Internal Control.
All right. And even though you weren't involved with that, there might be some influence of your activity through the Recovery Act on that.
I wish I could make that connection.
Okay. We're at the end of our time, but there's a question here. Before we go on, again, I'd like to thank sponsors, and we never thank our ALN senior fellows, of which Jack is a senior fellow, who bring so much to our organization and bring us in great directions, and our board. Also, we have a board Jack Kelly is also a member of our board, so thank you for that, and thank you to all of our board members. If you have other obligations, please feel free to drop off, but I'm going to proceed with a couple questions here. So when you presented to executives on their departmental risk management binders, how did they integrate that information? I'm sure everyone did it differently, but did you find anybody that was integrating that well?
No, and frankly, so the Recovery Act, I made no effort to integrate the risk management exercise that I was doing into anything else, because frankly, I couldn't find anything to integrate it with. Remember early on, I went to the people, the performance people and the financial people, and tried to get them to engage. I mean, it was going to be integrated with anybody. They would have been the people that would be managing scorecards and, like, for example, when you talk about a scorecard has meant different things over the course of my career. And so if you're talking about a performance scorecard, in other words, what your performance goals are and how well you're meeting those goals, there was no, well, put it this way, I had such a bad experience with the people who manage the performance.gov website that as far as I'm concerned, they weren't worth talking to. And it didn't matter. For me, what I cared about was just within the context of what I was asked to do, which was assess risk management within the context of the Recovery Act. That's what I did. And I didn't reach out further than that.
Okay. Did you see any common risk across the agencies as you were looking at them and how they were spending that Recovery Act funds?
Well, so remember that when I said earlier is that the main risks that the A123 at that time was looking at was the risk of things like fraud, waste, fraud, and abuse. And so they were, but I need to take a little sidebar to give you some context for my answer. One thing I failed to tell you was the Recovery Act set up a group called the Recovery and Accountability and Transparency Board. We called it the RAT Board. And the RAT Board had a staff that was housed in some leased office space not too far from where I worked. And that staff had set up a war room that literally looked like a command center. I mean, you had these enormous, wall-size TV screens with maps of the United States, and they could call up displays from where the money was going, where there were like hot spots that they had been, whistleblowers had said, this money here is being wasted, or these contracts are not being managed properly. They could display this enormous amount of data in a very powerful manner using these screens. And an enormous amount of effort went to that. So when it came to risk, I honestly don't know how they would have incorporated risk into those presentations, because the exercise I was running was in its own little bubble. And I had a lot to do with just me.
Everybody has bandwidth issues, but you seem to meet and exceed them very well. Then there was also a question about translating the information into their scorecard. So was there a way of doing that?
I did not. I don't recall having maintained my own scorecard. I mean, I had sort of the equivalent of a scorecard for each agency in these binders that I talked about, but I don't recall. It's just too long ago. I don't recall whether I maintained some high level scorecard. If I didn't, I hadn't kept it, so I couldn't find it when I was rifling through my old papers.
That's okay. We really appreciate everything that you bring to the ALN. And just today, I sent a letter to the Biden-Harris Transition Team Advisory Board with our draft executive order. And I recommended that perhaps you could talk with your former colleague, Jeff Zentz, about the value of that in a 15-minute conversation. and I'll let you know if we hear back.
Okay.
So thank you, and thanks to everybody who has attended. We appreciate your interest, and we want to let you know that we hope you all have a very good Thanksgiving next week. That'll be our first week off. We've had Thursday at 4 continuously since August. It's been a very good run, but I think we'll all appreciate a break. So happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Turkey at 4.
Pardon?
It'll be turkey at 4.
Turkey at 4. And hope you all enjoy a little bit of relaxation with your circle, with people in your bubble. Don't have the big events. Manage that risk. Thank you, everybody.
Our sponsor slides, just to make sure that we thank our organizational members, because again, without these organizations, we couldn't be doing what we're doing here.